welcome you again to another episode of Digging Deeper. And we are, as is our custom, or has become our custom the past few times, looking a little bit deeper into the message from Sunday. And today is no exception. Now, next week we will not have one of these because of Christmas, but we will resume the week after that. But next week we will be taken off. But I want to continue to deal with this series that we've been talking about. We've been doing the series called It's Not Too Late, and it's really a series about regrets and about how to deal with regrets, but not so much how to deal with past regrets, but how to live with fewer regrets in the future by us making good choices today. And so that's what we've continued to look at in this past message from this past Sunday was about finances. And I think if you are like me, you have many financial regrets. You have things that you purchased that you wish you had not purchased, or you have things that, decisions you made financially that you wish you hadn't made, all kinds of things like that. And so I think that that is not an uncommon sentiment that we would not be familiar with. I think every one of us has experienced regrets in the area of finances. So we're going to talk about that a little bit deeper, from a few different passages. We're going to look at that a little more broadly as well. And so I want to invite you to come along with that. I hope you're doing this with a group. I realize this is the holiday season, so maybe some groups are not meeting now. But if you are using this for a group, I hope that this is helpful. If not, hey, watch it by yourself and just think through some of these questions. But I hope that you are able to get some people around you who can look at these questions together, because I found that dealing with these questions with other people who have studied God's Word and who know Jesus is their Savior, there's a sense of wisdom that comes from them that they help us to understand better what we're looking at, and we can bounce our questions off each other. So hopefully that'll be useful for you no matter what your situation is. I hope that you enjoy investigating these topics a little bit more deeply. So first question, and this is the first three questions are the questions that we ask every time about the message from Sunday. But the first question is this: what did you like in the message? Was there something that you particularly had an affinity for, something that you thought was a really good point that you really enjoyed from the message? If there's something like that, I'd like you to share that with your group. And so I'm going to pause for a moment and give you an opportunity to talk about that. So let me pause right here. Okay, hopefully you had some things that you particularly enjoyed from the message. Second question is pretty much the opposite of that, and that is, what did you disagree with in the message? Maybe there was something that wasn't clear. Maybe there was something that was said in a way that it just left you wondering and it didn't make sense maybe, or maybe it was something that you just couldn't really see how that could be true. This is a great opportunity to share that with the group, and maybe you can get some clarity as a group on that question, because if you had that question, or maybe if there was something that you struggled with or disagreed with, it stands to reason that there's somebody else in the group that had that same response. And so let me give you a moment to talk about if there was something that you disagreed with in the message. We'll pause for a moment for that. Okay, third question, and these are the questions that we ask at the beginning every time, and so this is the third in that sequence. What do you remember the most from the message? What do you remember the most from the message? Maybe there was something that just really stood out to you, a point that was something that you thought was very, very important in the message. Share that now. If there was something that really stood out to you, what do you remember the most from the message? What was the thing that was the most memorable piece of the message? And maybe that is a broad theme, or maybe that is just a very specific point, but I'd like you to share that with the group now. Let me pause while you do that. Okay, well, let us get into the topic at hand, and the topic was really around financial regret and regrets about the use of money in our lives. But along with that, there was a focus on stewardship, and so we're going to touch on that as well during our time here. But let me ask a couple of questions that I would characterize as icebreaker questions. These are, in a lot of ways, opinion questions, these first two, and so there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. I would like you all to share your 2 cents with each other as we ask these, but let me ask the first one. How would you describe a greedy person? How would you describe a greedy person? Now let me pause and allow you to share your answers to that question, and then we'll come back in just a moment. Okay, I don't know what you came up with when you talked about or thought about the question, what is a greedy person? I think that could be answered a whole lot of different ways. But, I think that what I found in the dictionary was just a very specific definition in the English dictionary, and it was this: having or showing a selfish desire for wealth and possessions. Having or showing a selfish desire for wealth and possessions. Okay, that just gives us an idea of what greed is, because greed is one of those words that we sometimes will throw around, but we don't always really talk about, well, what exactly is greed? What is that? What is that specifically when we're talking about greed? What is that thing? When we think about greed, or when we think about a greedy person, I think sometimes we think of a miser. We think of somebody like Scrooge McDuck, or we think of somebody like, probably at this time of the year, our minds might go to Ebenezer Scrooge, right? And we think of that character in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And this is the wealthy guy who didn't want to pay his employee Bob Cratchit fairly. He didn't want to put coal, I think it was, in the furnace there to keep the place warm. He just sat behind his desk and counted his gold coins, and that was Ebenezer Scrooge's character, where he just gathered money and was just this miser who lived as inexpensively as he could and hoarded all the money he could. Well, I think that greed is a little bit trickier than that. Greed is a secret sin. I think a person who is greedy, it's rarely evident to us. In fact, I would almost hazard to say that it is impossible to recognize a greedy person. Maybe there's exceptions to that, but I think that's one of those things you just can't see because it's an internal thing. Greed is a heart issue. It's an internal issue. And so it's not something that is visible to people that from the outside. In fact, we're going to see it's sometimes even hard to detect in our own hearts. But certainly it's difficult to say, hey, that is a greedy person if I ever saw one. I think that's a difficult thing for us to do. You can't identify a greedy person at all. Person can be, and I think this is really important to understand. Sometimes we think that greed is something that is characteristic of wealthy people, okay? Now, I would suggest to you that you can be poor and greedy, you can be wealthy and greedy. It's not really a function of how wealthy or how poor a person is, because either way, a person can evidence and demonstrate greed in their life. Greed is, again, it's a heart issue. It doesn't have to do with how much a person has or how much a person doesn't have. It really comes down to what their attachment is to those things. I mean, the question really is, does this person have wealth and material possessions, or does that wealth and do those material possessions have them? I mean, that's really the question in greed. And so this having or showing a selfish desire for wealth and possessions is really impossible to detect when we look at a person. We can't tell it from their bank account. We can't tell it from how much they have. We can't tell from their socioeconomic status. It's impossible for us to pick up on that. It's a heart issue. So, second question, is greed an easy thing for us to identify within ourselves? Is greed an easy thing for us to identify within ourselves? Let me pause for a moment and give you a chance to discuss that. Well, I would say that greed is even difficult to see in our own lives. And I have yet to meet somebody who ran up to me and said, you know what, my problem is I'm a greedy person. I mean, you just don't run into people like that. I don't think most people are that self-aware oftentimes, or at least wouldn't acknowledge it publicly. But I think we can easily fall into the trap of thinking we're not greedy or we're immune to that, when we actually are very much susceptible to that. And I would add that in living in Western culture, living in America, as many of us who are watching this video are, probably, perhaps all of us that are watching this video, we live in very wealthy contexts. And so compared to the rest of the world, on the global scale, we are very wealthy. And so we almost live in a world of materialism, a world of that is consumed with possessions and with money. And because of that, it's kind of like asking a goldfish to talk about what water is like, for us to talk about what it's like to be in a place of abundance, and to talk about what it means to be greedy, because it's almost that we are infiltrated with this, that it's our culture, that it's where we live. And so it is difficult to detect, I think, greed in us because of the place we live, and because of the opportunities we have, and because of how much we have, really. Even those of us who have less than those around us, even in the context of America, are on the lower end of the amount of possessions we have. Still, on a global scale, we are incredibly prosperous. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. So all that to say, what is greed in our lives? How do we detect it? Well, I'm just going to throw this out, and we'll deal with this a little bit more. But I think that the heart of greed, and the way we can see greed in our lives, is by asking the diagnostic question, where do we find our security? So the question is, do we find our security in God and His provision, or do we find our security in the stuff that we have collected, or the finances that we've hoarded? And that is just a very, very, very important question to ask ourselves. Now, where are we finding our security? And so I don't know that it's easy to determine whether we are afflicted with greed, or if we've fallen into the pit of greed. But one thing we can do is ask ourselves that diagnostic question: where do I find my security? Do I find it in wealth, in finances, or do I find it in God Himself? And we're going to deal with that a little bit more here as we continue. Okay, well, this message this week was on the idea of stewardship, or a lot of it focused on stewardship as we deal with financial regret and not having those regrets. And I just remember that when I was growing up, I went to a church that would have missionaries come and speak. The missionaries the church supported would come into town and speak as a guest speaker on Sunday mornings quite often. And I remember one individual who was a missionary in Madagascar, which is a large island off the coast of Africa. And he would come in, and it seemed like every single time he would speak, which was fairly routine, it seemed like it was maybe every year. I don't know. It seemed like he was in town every year almost. But when he was there and when he was speaking, he would invariably talk about stewardship. He would always talk about stewardship. And I thought, wow, why is there, I mean, how do you talk about stewardship every single time? It seems like that is just a recurring, repetitive type of theme. I mean, couldn't you find anything else to speak on? Well, that was what the passage dealt with this Sunday, and I'm just going to read that again just to refresh our minds. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, and Paul is talking about his ministry and talking about the ministry that's been entrusted to him. So he's not so much talking about finances there, but he does talk about the principle of stewardship. And he says this is how one should regard us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. And so he talks about stewards as those who have been entrusted with something. In this case, with the gospel message and with the truth of who God is revealed in Christ. But nevertheless, he's making or laying out the principle that a steward is a person who has been entrusted with something. That the steward has something that is not their own, but they've been given this, and they are called to use that thing. And so that's exactly what you have here. And that missionary, I think he was focusing on that reality in our lives, that we are stewards. The whole Christian life is really an exercise in stewardship, because our life is not our own. Everything that we have is a gift from God. Everything, every blessing you can possibly think of that you have is a stewardship that you have from God that's been entrusted to you, that we are called to use for Him. And so that is true of everything. And I just wrote down a few examples. It's not, obviously our thinking as we're talking about this topic goes to finances and to possessions, but also think about our gifts. And by that I mean our capabilities, our skills, our talents. Those are a stewardship. Our relationships, the relationships we have in our lives, that's a stewardship. That's something that God has entrusted to us to use for Him. Our health. Our health is a huge thing. If you have a healthy body, whatever degree of health you enjoy, that is a stewardship from God. That's a gift from God that we are called to use for Him. Our position, whatever your position is, that is a gift from God that can be and should be used for Him and for His glory. And so that is a stewardship, our position. And then, one more I wrote down here, our intellect. We all have intellectual capabilities, however strong or whatever their particular strengths, what area of that intellectual strength is. But we have those that we're given, that we're called to steward and called to use for God in this world. And so whatever you have is a stewardship from God. And certainly that is true of finances. It's absolutely true about our possessions. So to use those for God's purposes. Okay, enough about that. Let's go to another passage, and I want to look at this passage that is going to take us a little bit deeper on this subject, specifically the subject of greed, and talking about how we can avoid having those regrets going forward about the way that we have used material things, used money, used finances. And so let me read this question, or read this passage to you, and then we will talk about it a little bit. So it is Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5 is what we're looking at. Hebrews 13 verse 5. Let me read that to you. Actually 5 and 6. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For He has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? So just to give us a very brief rundown on the book of Hebrews, we don't know who wrote it. But whoever the writer was writing to a group of Christians who had been Jews by ethnicity, and religiously, they had stepped out of Judaism into faith in Christ. They had embraced Jesus as Messiah. But what was happening then was that they were getting persecution from the Jewish community because of their faith in Jesus. And life had gotten very hard. They were being excluded probably in a number of ways, socially, economically, even some, we're getting close to incarceration. He even mentions the shedding of blood in there. And so these people were going through very difficult times. And so they were being tempted to bail out on their relationship with Christ. Now, that is why, and that's the context in which this verse is mentioned, I think that they were experiencing financial hardship as a result of this persecution and probably being excluded financially because of it. And so what you have is them being instructed by the writer of Hebrews to keep their lives free from the love of money and to be content with what they have. Now, I looked up content and looked at how that word was used in the New Testament, how it was used in the New Testament. And it's interesting, the word means enough. In a lot of passages, it's just used in terms of something being enough. Let me give you a couple examples where that word is used. One is in John 6. And if you remember in John 6, what happened there was Jesus had all these people that were gathered around him were listening to him teach. And as they were listening to him and doing his teaching, the time was getting later, and so he said to his disciples, hey, we need to feed these people. And there's like 5,000 people out there. And so he says this to his disciples, and Philip responds, look, if I had 200 denarii, they wouldn't be enough to feed these people. Now, denarius was about what a working person would get paid for a day's work. So you're talking about like almost what's approaching a year's salary to just provide lunch for these people. And there's the miracle and so forth. But it's interesting what the way Philip says this. He says, Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. And that word enough there is the same word for content here. It's the idea of, hey, it wouldn't be enough. And in Hebrews, he's saying it is enough, or the writer is saying it is enough. But this is just an example of how that word's used. Another place is 2 Corinthians 12:9. Remember, that's Paul talking about his thorn in the flesh, and he asked God 3 times to take it away from him. And this is how God responded. God said, it says, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That word sufficient there is the same word for content. Again, it's the idea of sufficiency, the idea of something being enough, the something being adequate. It's enough to satisfy us. And so when he uses this word content, that is the idea that you have enough. That when I assess what I have, I look at it and I say, God, thank you, I have enough. I have plenty. Okay, so that's what's going on there. And I hope, by the way, you were able to read that passage in a couple different translations. Sometimes that will make it more clear. But let's ask a few questions about this passage as we continue here, and I hope that will bring into focus our finances a little bit and how to avoid greed and consequently not to have so many regrets in our life in the financial way moving forward. So first question here, is money easy to fall in love with? Because you notice it says here in this passage, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. So be content, or keep your life free from the love of money. So question, is money easy to fall in love with? Why or why not? Is it money easy to fall in love with? Why or why not? Let me pause and give you a chance to discuss that for a moment. Okay, is money easy to fall in love with? Well, that's a good question there. Is money easy to fall in love with? We might say, no, I don't love money. I just really like it a whole lot. I think sometimes we play those word games, but the idea here is to be intimately connected with money and for it to be extremely important in our life and to consume us. And I will just say this: money is very attractive, right? Money is a very attractive thing, and so it must be easy to fall in love with. And I say that because a couple other places in Scripture, in 1 Timothy 3:3, there's a warning for church leaders not to be in love with money. That's a requirement for church leaders. In 1 Timothy 6:10, it says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Now, sometimes that's misquoted, or sometimes you'll hear that said that money is the root of all evil. Well, that is taken from this verse, and actually the verse says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And so these kind of warnings point out to us that it must be very easy to be seduced, to be taken hold of by money, and for it to work its way into our hearts to become something that we're greedy for, and that we becomes the centerpiece of our life and what we're working for. And so, I would say that it's very easy to fall in love with money. And again, that's a function of our culture, is the fact that we almost can fall in love with money and be unaware of it, that we're not even aware that we are embracing money and that it's taken hold of us. We just don't even realize that. Well, question number 2 here, how do we detect the love of money in our lives? How do we detect the love of money in our lives? And let me pause for a moment while you discuss that. How do we detect the love of money in our lives? Okay, hopefully you came up with some thoughts on that. I think it is, again, we mentioned this earlier, but it is difficult to detect the love of money in our lives. That is not something that is readily discerned or easy to notice. I wrote down here that lovers of money never have enough. I mean, there's never enough. And if you ever watched VeggieTales, there's a episode where Bob and Larry, Bob the tomato is saying to Larry, I think the cucumber, Larry, how much stuff do you need to make you happy? And Larry the cucumber says, I don't know, just how much stuff is there? And so sometimes we are in the pursuit of constantly trying to get more and more and more and more stuff. And that is exactly what they were talking about. I think of John Rockefeller. He was, well, we talk about wealthy people today, but he was probably maybe the wealthiest person in American history, certainly. And we talk about people being in the 1%, being people who have the 1% most wealth, you know, the 1% richest people. But listen to this, John Rockefeller, his net worth at the time he was alive was 1% of the U.S. economy. I don't mean he was in the top 1%. I mean, his net worth was 1% of the entire American economy. We can't even get our heads around that. I mean, that's just money like we can't even fathom. It makes the Bill Gates and the Warren Buffetts of today look like they're in the poorhouse. So anyway, one time somebody asked John Rockefeller how much money would be enough, and he said just a little bit more. And so, lest we get too hard on Mr. Rockefeller, we can have that same attitude in our hearts and have that same pursuit for the material things of this world that we pursue at the expense of all kinds of things and to our own peril. And so, how do we detect the love of money in our lives? Well, it's really by looking at that question and saying, do we have enough? I mean, am I satisfied with what I have? Is what I have, am I content with what I have? Is it enough? Am I satisfied? Is it sufficient? And if not, if we can't answer that question, if we're not in a place where we answer it, well, that is a symptom of greed taking hold of our hearts. So I think that question is really important. Do we have enough? Am I content with what I have? That's really what the verse is getting at. Okay, question 3. Is it difficult to be content? How can we grow in our career, improve our financial condition, etc., while staying content? Does seeking a promotion mean we are not content? Okay, let me ask those again. Is it difficult to be content? How can we grow our career, improve our financial condition, etc., while staying content? Does seeking a promotion mean we are not content? Let me pause for a moment while you discuss those as a group, those questions, several questions embedded there, but they're all headed the same direction. Let me pause for a moment. Okay, now let me just make something clear at the outset of answering this question, and that is this, that there is a difference between complacency and contentment. Okay, contentment and complacency are two different things. You have to make a distinction between those two. We can strive. There's nothing wrong with striving to improve our financial our financial condition, rather. So if there's an opportunity for a promotion at work, it doesn't mean we should say, "Oh no, I don't want that." Or if there is a opportunity, a business opportunity maybe that presents itself, it's not to say, "Oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take advantage of that. I'm going to step back because I don't need any more. I'm satisfied with what I have." Okay, there's nothing wrong with pursuing opportunity in those ways. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But there's a difference between complacency and contentment. Complacency is saying I'm not going to try to take advantage of any opportunities that come my way, and I'm just not going to try to advance myself in any way. But contentment says, if those opportunities do not come, I am satisfied still. Okay, so take an advancement, take the opportunity to better yourself financially if it's available. But if those things are not possible or available, contentment says that is okay. I am content nonetheless. I'm satisfied. It is enough. What I have is enough. The question is, the question here is, are we okay if it doesn't happen? If the raise doesn't come along, if the better job opportunity doesn't present itself, if we don't get that business opportunity to come down the pike, are we still content? Or can we still say, I have enough, I am satisfied with what I have? I mean, that's really the question here when we're dealing with this issue. And so, is it difficult to be content? Well, yeah, I think it is. But to grow in our career, financial condition, that is absolutely fine. That just means we're not being complacent. But when it's in our capability to do those things without making that our overarching pursuit and the thing that takes hold of us and that the center of all our decisions, but we can take those opportunities for advancement. But the question is, if those things don't happen, am I still okay with that? That's really the question here, and that's how we get to the heart of contentment. One more question here, second to last. Does God's presence with us help us with the issue of greed and contentment? And the question is, how? Does God's presence with us help us with the issue of greed and contentment? And how? Okay, and that seems like a strange question, but looking back at Hebrews chapter 13, take a look at that. Let me read that to you again, because this verse has everything, and these verses have everything to do with God's presence with us. So listen to this. In this context of money and greed, it says here, verse 5 again, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? That tells us that there is a very strong connection between God's provision and his character and his presence with us and our battle against greed and our ability to be content. God is, I think what the writer of Hebrews here is saying is that God is our provider. He's the one who provides for us faithfully. And he's the one who gives us what we need. You remember back in Genesis chapter 22, way back there in Genesis 22, you have that episode where God tells Abraham to take his son, his only son Isaac, whom he loves, up to the mountain top and sacrifice him on this sacrificial altar. And right before he's about to slay his son, the angel of the Lord intervenes and says, don't do it. I know you trust me. And then Abraham looks over in the thicket, and there is a ram that's in the thicket bush. And so instead of sacrificing his son, Abraham sacrifices the ram. And Abraham calls that place Yahweh Yireh, or you might have heard Jehovah Jireh, depending on who is saying it. But Yahweh Yireh means the Lord will see to it, literally, but it means that the Lord will provide. And so the reality here is in this passage is that the writer of Hebrews is saying we can be content because we have a God who provides for us, who is faithful to us, who is with us, and is the source of every good thing. And so if you have somebody in your life who is abundantly, infinitely wealthy, who is able to give you whatever you and I need, then we don't really have any reason to be discontent. We can be satisfied. We can say, I have enough because I have this incredible provider who never will leave me, never will forsake me. And so I can be satisfied. Okay, I see the connection. I hope that was helpful, or you can see that there. Last question: is God enough when money is lacking? How can we get to the point where He is? That's kind of the practical application of this. How is God enough when money is lacking? How can we get to the point where He is? Let me pause while you discuss that. Okay, hopefully you came up with some good thoughts on that. I think that there is, what we've talked about, recognizing God's presence, recognizing greed when it shows up in our hearts. But I want to give you a couple of things here. And the first thing that is really what should be our first resort in every area of our life is prayer. And I want to give you a prayer that is a biblical prayer. Okay. In fact, it's strange. I just ran across this morning. I send my couple of my kids a verse every day from Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in the Bible. It's 176 verses, and it is in its entirety about God's Word in one shape, form, or another. And so today I was reading verse 36, and let me just read that to you because I think this is an incredible prayer as we seek to find our sufficiency in God and to fight against greed and the regret that brings, and to just center ourselves in the reality of God's provision and His presence with us. So this is Psalm 119, 36. Let me share that with you. Psalm 119, verse 36 says this: incline my heart to your testimonies and not to selfish gain. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to selfish gain. I just think it's an incredible prayer. And when we feel greed getting a hold of our hearts, I think what a great prayer to pray. This is a brief 2-line prayer. Incline my heart to your testimonies, your word, your ways, and not to selfish gain. I love that. That's a great prayer. So number one, I would say, as we fight this battle for contentment, finding God enough when money is lacking and getting to the point where He is, that's the first thing, is prayer. But the second thing is this: I think just confessing it, acknowledging it, really acknowledging what this verse, I think Hebrews 13, 5 through 6 are incredible verses to memorize. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Therefore we can say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear what can man do to me. I mean, those are so powerful. There's so much there. And I think when we feel a sense of lack, or feel that we are pursuing financial things in the wrong way, reading those verses, letting those wash over our hearts. And I think just confessing the fact that God is enough and that He is our provider is so powerful. Let me give you something I think we could say, is that God, I confess you are all I need. You are the source of all I have. God, I confess that you are all I need. You are the source of all I have. If we would just say that over and over again to ourselves and remind us of that reality and believe it, I think that can transform our thinking when it comes to this whole issue of greed and being satisfied, saying it is enough what I have. And so again, not talking about complacency, but contentment. We're talking about being content, about being satisfied with what God has given. And I just hope that maybe this time that we spend in Hebrews 13 and looking a little bit more deeply at this topic that is such a reality in our worlds, in our culture, I hope this has been helpful to you. And I hope that you've been able to glean some wisdom from your group members there, and that you've been able to just get a little clarity on this. But I would say that prayer, incline my heart to your testimonies and turn away my heart from selfish gain, and then just confessing that God is all I need, that you are the source of all I have. I think those two approaches to this issue can be very powerful, and I hope that you've come up with some that are even maybe more effective than those. I'm sure you have. So anyway, thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. Happy New Year. And again, I'm just delighted to be with you. And I hope that this was helpful. And I hope that you all had a good time discussing these things together. See you next time. Bye.